Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Keith Warburton, and I'm going to be talking you through this Sannam S4 webinar, working with colleagues at a distance. Unfortunately, my colleague Ed Ditson, who was going to be here with me today, is a bit indisposed today, so he can't make it. So I'm just going to run through this myself. So the plan is that I'm going to speak for about half an hour, and if you would like to ask me any questions, then please type them in the box and I'll attend to those questions at the end when we get to that. The first thing I want to say is that this working with colleagues at a distance, Indian colleagues at a distance, obviously it's a very large topic, and I'm going to speak for about half an hour on this. So I suppose if I get my excuses in early, I can't hope to cover this topic in its entirety. But what I'd like to do is to just cover off a few of the headline issues which I've come across from my experience of working in this corridor. I've got a series of slides that I'll talk you through, and the first one is just an overview of what I'm going to cover. So I'll tell you a little bit about my experience and how I happen to be here in a few minutes, and then I'm going to talk a little bit generically about the impact that cultural differences can have when you're working in a cross-border environment. And I want to make a few general points there, rather than speaking specifically about India and India working with Indian colleagues. I want to talk a little bit about our responsibilities when we're dealing into India, because I think very often we're looking at maybe what Indian colleagues need to be doing that they're not doing, but I think we need to look at ourselves in this as well. So what are our responsibilities here? And then I've got a series of headline issues I want to go through, which you can see outlined there: communication issues, the impact of hierarchy, structuring your business, issues around role definition. I want to talk a little bit about the thorny topic of attrition in India. I want to talk about the role of metrics and some of the difficulties that metrics can bring into the relationship. The issue of initiative comes up very regularly. So I'll cover off all of those, and then, as I said at the end, if there's any questions, just type them in the box, and one of my colleagues will relay them to me, and I'll try and cover off as many as I can at the end. So just starting off a little bit about my experience. I'm the International Business Development Director of Sannam S4. And as you probably know, Sannam S4, we're kind of the leading company helping Western businesses to enter and exploit a market in India. So obviously I'm working constantly with Western businesses who are looking to enter India, to work with Indian colleagues and develop their business. So I have that experience. In addition to that, over the last 10 to 15 years, I've worked on a large number of big outsourcing projects from Europe and the States, where major multinational companies have been transitioning large numbers of employees from their home countries into India. And I've done a lot of work on the interface issues that arise in that process, working with teams both in Europe and the States and hearing what the issues are from their perspective, but also doing a lot of work in India with the Indian teams, who talk to me a lot about what the difficulties are from their side when they're interfacing back into the home team. So that's the kind of general background that I bring to this, and what a lot of my comments are based on. A general comment would be that there's no black and white in all of this. There's lots of shades of grey. And so some of the things that I say, people that are listening may disagree with from their own experience, have a different take on it. And that's absolutely fine. I think one of the key issues about this whole cross-border interface is that the more discussion there is on it, the healthier it is for any organisation. I think problems start to occur when people try and pretend that these issues aren't there, that the problems don't arise. And so, if you disagree with me, then please let me know, and I'm happy to take that on board. What I wanted to start off with, as I've said, was just a couple of words, very briefly, about the impact that cultural differences can have when you're working in a cross-border environment, and specifically around the issue of factoring in your own biases. What you have to bear in mind is that you individually are the product of your upbringing. You're a product of the influences that you have personally been through in the country that you're from. So your parental influences, your schooling, your higher education, and from my perspective, crucially, your formative years in the workplace. All of these have an impact on the way in which you operate and the way in which you see the world. And the result of that is that everybody wears a pair of cultural spectacles. And if you are, for example, British or American, the lenses in your spectacles were made in the UK or the USA, and it colours the way in which you view the world, the way in which you react and respond to everybody and everything. But of course, what you need to bear in mind is that when you are dealing and interfacing into India, then your Indian colleagues are also wearing a pair of cultural spectacles, but the lenses in their spectacles were manufactured in a different place. And their lenses will give them a differing and sometimes very differing worldview. Their whole appraisal criteria around what constitutes good professional approach from a colleague or a leader might be completely different than you're used to in your own country. And that simple fact, I think, accounts for the fact that quite often when you work in a cross-border environment, you do something in another country in a way that you know, if you did it in your own country, that would be well received. But you do it in exactly the same way somewhere else, and it seems to go quite badly, and you can't really work out why. But that's very often because you're being judged by a differing, and crucially, very often a largely unknown set of appraisal criteria. You have to accept when you work in any cross-border environment that you do not necessarily see yourself as the people you're dealing with see you. They will have a different perspective on the way in which you're operating. And the result of that, I think, is that we need to recognize that, and we need to try to develop very high levels of objectivity. You need to be a lot less subjective in your thinking and a lot more objective. I suppose that what I'm really saying is that you need to try and take your cultural spectacles off. It's really easy for me to sit here and tell people to take their cultural spectacles off, but in reality, that's quite a difficult thing to do because the programming, the influences you have inside you are so hardwired. And what you tend to find in a cross-border environment is that cultural differences, they're never generally a problem until you have a problem. And that's when these things really start to kick in. And it's when you have to keep all of these issues right at the front of your mind. It's an intellectual activity, if you like. Well, having said that, in all of these different approaches to the way in which people operate in a working environment, there's no real right or wrong in it. There's just difference. And we have to recognize that those differences are there and work out solutions to manage through the differences. Because if you don't work out solutions to manage through the differences, then that's when they become problems. And if they become problems, which they quite often do, then they can have a really significant and direct impact on your effectiveness and inevitably, I think, on your profitability. And that's why these interface issues things, for me, they're not a soft, woolly issue. They're diamond hard. And organizations really need to take this right into their heart and for it to become part of the warp and weft of their business. And so those Western home teams, they need to take on board this as a responsibility of their own. I think home teams very often expect Indian colleagues to work in a way which is very aligned to the working style of the home team, which is not an unreasonable expectation. But then you've got to ask the question, have we actually taken the time to explain what our expectations are? I think sometimes Western home teams just expect their Indian colleagues to somehow, by some kind of magical osmosis, know what our expectations are. And they won't, not unless you really explain that to them fully. We can't expect people to meet our expectations if we haven't explained what they are. And that goes a lot beyond, in my view, just talking about what the metrics are. The metrics are quantifiable, they're numbers, but we're going into behaviours here and thought processes and attitudes, and that's a lot deeper than that. And so what I think everybody, both the home teams and people in India need, is they need to be aware as a first step that these cultural issues can really significantly impact on effectiveness. I think secondly, when they're aware of that, they need to have some knowledge of what the differences are. And then when they're aware and when they know they've got that knowledge, then I think you need to dive into the third part of the process, which is, okay, so how does that awareness and knowledge, how can we implement that in terms of improving our processes and our systems? And what I want to focus on a little bit in this webinar are some of the key issues around working with Indian colleagues from a cultural perspective and where some of the issues might arise. So I would say that one of the key problems, issues that Western home teams talk to me about when they're dealing into India are around communication issues. And in a way that's quite surprising because English is very widely spoken in India. It's not ubiquitous, but it's very widely spoken, and it's very widely spoken to a very high standard. There's no doubt about that, and that's obviously a tremendous advantage both for the home teams and for India itself, because it gives us that communication bridge. But I think it can also lull people into a false sense of security. And one of the reasons I firmly believe that is because I think even when the British are dealing with Americans, you know, we speak the same language, but we still have communication differences and difficulties because although we speak the same language, we use language differently. Our style of communication is very different. And so obviously that's going to be the case when you're dealing with India as well. And so at a surface level, obviously there are going to be some vocabulary differences, some words that Indians would use that maybe the Brits or the Americans wouldn't, and vice versa. And there's going to be some phrases that are used. You get phrases like prepone and things like that, which you wouldn't hear in the West, but which are commonly heard in India. You get backside for the back of for the back of something. You get various different phrases that are used, and that's at a surface level. And I think you can work around that by having a lexicon of differences of vocabulary between India and the UK or the USA. That's not a problem. But I think there are certain other things which go a bit deeper than that. And so one of the things that I've got there which comes up a lot is that when I say to Western teams, what's one of the issues you face when you're interfacing into India, they'll say, well, they say yes to everything. It's yes, yes, yes. You very rarely hear the word no. I think that's true. I think Indians are reticent to say no to people, especially people who are their superiors, their bosses. They don't like to say no. I think on the whole, Indians would like to kind of tell you what they think you want to hear. And that's not because they're trying to be devious or trying to cause problems. I think it's because they have a genuine and enthusiastic desire to do a great job and to please. But if that is a cultural characteristic, which I think it is, then I think there's an onus on the home teams to dig a bit deeper. And I think the way that you need to do that is by very careful and skillful questioning. So I don't think we help ourselves in this issue because people will ask somebody in India a question like, we are okay for the deadline on Friday, aren't we? And I think the answer to that is likely to be yes, regardless of what the truth of the matter is. So that's not a very helpful question because in a way you're giving the answer that you want to hear within the question. I think a question such as, can you tell me at exactly what point in the process we are now? And when you get the result of that more detailed question, you can yourself work out where are you going to hit that deadline on Friday or not? And so I think we need to get into the habit of really careful and precise questioning to try and ascertain where we are in the process or where we are to do with the deadline or whatever the issue might be. And that's an onus on us, I think, in the West to try and develop that. And obviously, the most pointless question in the English language is, do you understand? Because the answer is always yes. So I think thinking very hard about your communication style is absolutely critical. Just because we speak the same language doesn't necessarily mean that everything we say is understood. And I'll come back to some of these issues as we go through. The next thing I've got here is the impact of hierarchy. I think it's just an indisputable fact that India is a hierarchical culture. I worked in Japan for 4.5 years, and people say that Japan is an extremely hierarchical culture, which it is. But I think India is probably the most hierarchically structured business culture in the world, and I think that's probably as a direct result of 4,000 years of the caste system or whatever, which is in itself a societally based hierarchical mindset. And hierarchy exists not just in the business environment, it exists in society as well. But what I wanted to say was, I don't think you should see this as a negative. Why is hierarchy a negative? If you go back 30 or 40 years in the UK or the USA, we were massively more hierarchical than we are now. For some reason, over the past 20, 30, 40 years in the West, hierarchy has become a dirty word. But the vast majority of the world still operates in a hierarchical way. Those of us who are more matrixed are the exception globally rather than the rule, and I think we need to recognise that. So hierarchy is all pervasive in India. It is going to be in the mindset of most of the people that you employ. Wishing it wasn't there is not going to change that. You just have to accept that it is there. And you know, it impacts on all kinds of different areas. One of the most obvious areas it impacts on is job titles. In the West now, job titles have become a little bit of an irrelevance. I really don't care what my job title is. But in India, job titles are very important. It can have all kinds of impacts, both from a societal and a business base, and people will be very concerned that they get a title which they think is appropriate to their status, their educational background, their position in the company. And if you see that, what we would see as obsession with titles as a negative thing and kick against it, I think you're just causing yourself problems there. Work hard with people to help them get the title which they feel comfortable with. It's going to make them feel a lot better about their working environment. Another impact of hierarchy is that leadership is potentially more paternalistic than it would be in the West. I think leaders are expected to lead. I think leaders are expected to tell people what to do, because that's why they're the leader. They're the boss, they should know. And I think followers are expected to follow. And I think sometimes they're expected to follow without much pushback, without disagreeing with the boss, because the boss is the boss and he's been given that position because he has the capability, the skills, the experience, etc. And so if you are sitting there expecting pushback from your Indian colleagues, if you're expecting them on those conference calls to challenge or disagree with either you or their local leader, that is very unlikely to happen. And again, I get criticism from the West of people because they don't do that. It's just unlikely to happen. If you want that to happen, then you've got to start a retraining program, if you like, and teaching people how you want them to operate. Age and experience are important. People will very often talk about how long they've been with an organisation or how long they've been in the industry, because that gives them gravitas. Age is worthy of respect in and of itself, not the quality of your last results or your last decision. The fact that you're older gives you an automatic right for respect. And again, in the West now, a lot of those things have changed. And then the other thing, I think, which is a positive, I think it's a positive in India. I think it gives a great vibrancy to India. But because it's hierarchical, people want to achieve. They're aspirational, and they want to get ahead, and they want to get ahead as quickly as possible. So they want promotion. They want a better job title. They want, a better salary, and all of the things that will bring with them. India is no longer a cheap country. Things are becoming much more expensive in India. So obviously people need to keep pace with that. So they're aspirational, they're aspirational for themselves and their families, and they want to get ahead. And that leads me to another point, which is business structures. So a lot of Western businesses, when they go into India, what they want to do is they want to import their global structure, which very often is a flatter matrixed approach, with few grades, with few opportunities for advancements in terms of position and job title. And that can cause you lots of problems if you just cut and paste your Western structure into India. Obviously, the flatter your business is in India, the less opportunity there is for advancement. And so one of the direct results of importing a flat system into India, I think, is that it promotes high rates of attrition. Because if I can't get ahead in this organization, if there is no better job title, if I'm not going to get promoted, I'm not going to get that rise above the inflationary rise that everybody else is going to get, then I'm going to look elsewhere for another job. And if you have high rates of attrition, and I'll come back to attrition a little bit later on, but if you have high rates of attrition, that's going to really impact on your cost base, because you're going to have increased retraining costs for new people coming in, and also increased recruitment costs, because if you end up 30-35% level of attrition, that's going to cost you in terms of recruitment. But it's also going to give you recruitment problems, because people coming in, if they're trying to find out what your structure is, and you say it's completely flat and there's no advancement opportunities, then that's going to be a disincentive for people to join the business. Of course, your brand, your reputation might counterbalance that, but it is going to be a worry in the back of people's minds. And if, for example, you're in the knowledge process outsourcing business, and you need people who have high levels of knowledge in your sector or your business, the higher your attrition rate is, the more likelihood you have of having mistakes, missing deadlines, etc., etc. So I think you've got to think very carefully when you enter India about how you're actually going to structure your business. Do you have to have the same structure everywhere in the world? Are you losing sight of what your goal of being in India is there, just because you want to keep the same process everywhere in the world? It's something you have to really consider at a very early stage of development in India. Role definitions, I think it's important that you get these right and have them well aligned to well-structured key result areas, KRAs. I think sometimes when you have these KRAs with Indian colleagues, they can become a little bit obsessed about meeting the KRAs. And because they're so obsessed on what those KRAs are, things around the side tend to get lost because they're not in the KRAs. So they're obviously deemed as being less important. So I think you've got to think very carefully that your KRAs are very closely aligned to whatever your actual goals are. But on the same basis, you can't have 25, 30 KRAs. And that whole process of getting your key result areas really well buttoned down and aligned, it's something you need to think very carefully. It's something about you need to work very closely with your Indian colleagues with. And then when you've really defined what they are, I think you've got to really explain them to your colleagues as well, to make sure that things don't get lost in translation there, so that they're fully aligned to understanding those KRAs in the same way that you understand them. Just coming back to attrition, they are notoriously high in India. That's just a fact again. Why is that? Well, as I said, people are aspirational. Western businesses import flat systems, so people get a little bit stuck in their job and they want promotion, so they move on to next door. But also, it's a very vibrant job market in India. There's new entrants coming in all the time. We know that, Sannam, because we help a lot of those new entrants to enter and develop their business in India. And so there are prospects at your competitors. And if you're not building into your systems opportunities for advancement and progression, then people will actually decide and vote with their feet and move next door. I think another driver for attrition is that sometimes, especially in a BPO type of environment, the work that we transition to India is simply quite boring and repetitive. In fact, in my experience, it's very often sold to the home teams in that way. People say to the home teams, don't worry about transitioning some of the work to India, because what we're going to do is we're going to take the really boring, repetitive work away from you and leave the interesting stuff for you to do, and we're going to send all of that boring and repetitive stuff to India. And surprisingly, or not surprisingly, when people in India start, highly educated people in India, highly motivated people in India start doing this boring, repetitive work, they will also find it boring and repetitive, and it's not something they're going to want to do for a very long time. So finding a route for people, not just to develop in terms of promotion, but also in terms of interesting levels of work, that's a really important thing. You need to work very hard at what your process and system is going to be to counter these attritional trends. You need to look at your training and education system, what your prospects for advancement are. We do a lot of work with clients, helping them to work out those things, and that's quite a complex thing, but it is well worth putting some time and effort into. Metrics. I think metrics can be very problematic. First of all, they're often very quantitative, so we're measuring 93.7% accuracy of delivery of deliverables on a monthly basis, and if we only make 92.6%, then they've missed their metric. And sometimes you think, well, they may have missed their metric, but there may have been very good reasons why they missed the metric, because they were focusing on something which is of far more value to the business. But the metric is the metric, and people are judged on that. And if people are constantly missing their metrics, then they're going to worry about that. They're going to worry about what their future is in the business. So I think metrics, of course, they need to be quantitative, but they also need to be qualitative. And what I find very often is that the home team's goals are not really very well aligned to the metrics by which the Indian colleagues are judged. And you have to make sure that if they're going to, we want these people to work in a team, then their goals and their drive and their objectives have got to be very carefully aligned. And they've got to be achievable. Well, I quite often get into a situation where people say, and the home teams, they haven't met their 93.7% metric this month. And I say that sounds quite high. What was it? What was the percentage delivery when it was done in the USA or the UK? And people say, well, I don't know, because we didn't measure it then. And people look back to a golden age where everything was apparently perfect when it was done in the USA and the UK. And I don't believe that that golden age ever existed. So the metrics have to be fair. And you need to factor in local conditions. So we had a client who was concerned that some of their salespeople weren't meeting their meetings metrics. They weren't having enough meetings per day. They wanted to have six metrics in a day in Bangalore. Well, that's very difficult. The conditions, the environment, the transport, it makes it difficult to achieve that. So it has to be a metric which is achievable in the local environment. I think if you're measuring Indians, you should be measuring your home teams as well. I think it's got to be equitable. Why is one side measured and not the other? That's going to disincentivize people, I think. And don't lose sight of the end goal. Don't make the metrics the holy grail, because they very rarely are. It's whatever your key commercial objective is, that's the holy grail. I think that issues around initiative is one of the most commonly raised issue by the home teams. There is a feeling very often amongst the home teams that their Indian colleagues do not show initiative. The complaint which is often levelled is that they don't really think outside the box. Well, I think first of all, as we said before, Indian leadership style is more directive. It's paternalistic. It's much more directive than you would find in the West these days. And therefore, I think an Indian colleague's default position is to expect their leader, their boss, whoever, to give them pretty full, direct and complete instructions, which they will carry out very well. But I think sometimes from the West, we give very incomplete instructions on the assumption that people will be able to just figure out what it is that we want them to do. But if your default position is that I will follow the instructions that I've been given, then if you give incomplete instructions, then probably an incomplete job will be done. And when things don't happen that you wanted to happen, my advice to the Western teams is go back to your initial instructional style. Were your instructions concise, precise and comprehensive? And if they were, great. Let's look for another reason. But I think quite often you'll find that they weren't, that there's gaps in that. So if there are gaps in the instructions or there are holes in the process, then obviously problems will arise from that. I think an Indian perspective might be, well, if you wanted something done, why didn't you tell me? And our answer would be, because I wanted you to use your initiative. And I think there's a big gap between those two. And so I think it's all about explaining your expectations to your Indian colleagues so they can know exactly what it is you're expecting them to do. And then, as I said, I was going to speak for about half an hour, so just kind of wrapping up. Just remember, it's a two-way thing. If things don't happen, if you're on the Western side, if things don't happen as you want them to, I'd start by questioning your own approach. Because in my experience, in these cross-cultural issues, the tendency is always for people's default knee-jerk reaction is to say it's all their fault. And it's never all their fault. It's always partly their fault and partly my fault. And so you have to start to analyse where you are in this process, what your part in this process is. I think you need to explain everything. Very often the home teams have a much more complete knowledge about everything than the Indian teams, who are at a distance and don't have the benefit of being in the head office and being privy to all of that kind of extra detail. Explain everything and put everything into context. You're working with highly motivated, highly educated people in India on the whole. And they don't just want to be told what to do either. They want to be told what to do, but they want to be told why, what's the context around that, so they can put it into the picture. And I think my final point would be that positive feedback goes a very long way in India. And I think that, you know, there is a tendency to only tell people bad news, tell people when things have gone wrong, and when things go right, we just say, well, that's just what should happen anyway. But I think getting into the habit of giving frequent positive feedback in India can reap a lot of rewards. So I've covered a lot of stuff very quickly there, and as I said at the beginning, this is a massive topic, and each of those slides I could go into in a lot more detail. And I know on a webinar you don't just sit around too long, so there are a few things that that I thought it's important to bear in mind when you're dealing into India. We will send you through the slides, and I'm happy to look at any questions that have come through. So I'm not sure whether any questions have come through. Okay, so I think there's one question that's come through, which I'm looking at now. How broad or narrow are typical KRAs? Well, I think that's I think I've seen all ends of that spectrum. I've seen very, very narrow ones, I've seen very broad ones. But I think my point was not on the narrowness or the breadth of them. I think my question was more around how aligned are they to actually achieving the results that the business wants to achieve. And I think that, you know, the starting point there is you write a KRA for somebody, and then you say, okay, so if they achieve that KRA, what impact will that have on the business? Is that going to deliver the impact that we want it to deliver? And if it doesn't, why doesn't it? And what do we have to add to it? And then once you've decided that, then you have to discuss it with your colleagues in India. You have to explain it. You have to put context into it. Tell people what the implications of missing that KRA are. So it's a whole process that has to be gone through. Some could be broad, some could be narrow. There's another question that's come in here, which is about job titles and how many layers of job titles should there be. And I think that's a question that you have to look at if you're a global organisation in a broader way. So the question you've got to address yourself is: are we comfortable with having a differing system of titling our executives in India, or are we not? If the answer to that is no, we have to have a global approach to this, then that's fine. I've not got a problem with that. But then what you have to work very hard at is explaining that to your staff in India, why you have that system, what the benefits of that system are, both to the organisation and to them as individuals. If you decide that we're not really that bothered and we don't really care what people's job titles are, then I think you want to work very closely with local advisors, because the job titles that will attract people might be slightly different than you would have them in your own country. And you need to be defining that and looking at how many incremental steps you want to build into your structure. But for me, that's something that needs to be looked at a very early stage of going into India. I don't think well, a lot of our clients come to us because it's a problem that they come up with. They've been in India for 2 years, they've got high attrition rates, and one of the reasons for that is very often because of these job title things. I've got another one here, which is what tips on productivity from a Western work environment do you think could be beneficial to an Indian work environment? Well, I think that what I'm never saying here is that you cannot take your systems and processes into India, because I know businesses that have done that quite successfully. But what I think you have to do is start with the starting point that the people you're dealing with in India might not necessarily by default understand why those are good processes and systems. And therefore you've got to work very closely in training people on what benefits those systems are and why implementing them will add real value to the business. If you're saying, for example, can we import a culture of punctuality, which is a kind of Western process, punctuality is very important, then again I would say absolutely you can do that if that's what you want to do. But again, starting off with the default position that is not the default situation in India. Time is more elastic in India, we all know that. But I've worked with businesses who have implemented a very structured system of timekeeping, a very structured meeting process, which everybody goes to, agendas are followed, meeting notes are taken and circulated, etc. But again, that's a learning and development process, and you have to pick your battles. What's important to you? What's not important to you? Where do we want to put our resource in terms of development and training, etc. So there's another one coming on. What methods would you use to encourage initiative and confidence in challenging the boss? Well, I think that is a really, really big question. So my starting point would be just to challenge, why do you want to do that? And I think our answer is because through our cultural spectacles, that's a good thing. But lots of cultures think that's a bad thing. What is the benefit to you of doing that? If you think the benefits of getting people to use more initiative and challenge their boss are really, really quite good, that's a real benefit to your business, then I think what you've got to do is you've got to train people in those behaviours. And I've done a lot of stuff in India around encouraging certain behaviours that the Western teams want to develop in their Indian colleagues. So we've done a lot of workshops on developing sense of individual initiative, about becoming more challenging with your boss. But it's not something that is, again, the default position. And you have to say, this is a real key thing for our business, and therefore we're going to devote time, we're going to devote learning development budget for this. And if you're going to do those two things, you've got to, first of all, make sure that you're not suffering from high attrition rates, because you don't want to do all of that developmental stuff and then lose those people. Because those issues around initiative and challenging the boss, most Western companies are looking for Indian employees who can exhibit those characteristics. So if you train people and you get them good at that, they become a hot property in the market. So you've got to have your attrition really well under control as well. But we, as I say, we've run a lot of training programs on doing that type of thing. I'm very happy to pick up that in more detail at another stage. Okay, so I think that is most of the questions that have come through. There may be one or two others that I've not picked up, which we can answer offline by email. As I said at the beginning, we will share the slides with you, and I hope you've found this useful. It's a very large topic. I've kind of skimmed the surface of it. There's a lot of things that we could go into in much more depth, and we've been very helpful, very happy to help anybody with any of these issues. But thank you very much for taking the time, and I hope you found the session useful. Thanks very much. Goodbye.